Welcome to the HC Insider Podcast, a podcast dedicated to the commodities sector and the people within it. I'm your host, Paul Chapman. Today we're talking insects and commodities. An unlikely pairing, yet insects are fundamental to biodiversity, to the agricultural sector, and as we shall see, we have a lot to learn from them in decision theory. Here to talk about insect farming and swarm theory and its implications for trading decisions is Charlie Drew. Charlie is an insect technology specialist and has spent several years with robotic systems as well as the world's largest farmed insect colonies. He spent several years building intelligent robotic systems as well as managing the world's largest farmed insect colonies. He's now co-founder and COO of Swarm, a fund that is deploying swarm intelligence to investing strategy, including in commodities. As always, if you enjoy the show, please do leave us a positive review on the platform you're listening on. It really supports us. And as always, I hope you enjoy the episode. Charlie, welcome to the show.
Thanks very much for having me, Paul.
So I'm looking forward to the discussion. We are talking, I think, two things that don't necessarily obviously go together, but insects and commodities, and there's quite a story to tell here. Before we dig into that story, can you just, as a backdrop for us, as an entomologist, a specialist in this field, can you give us some sense of how important insects are to, you know, the functioning of the world and the world economy and its biosphere?
Absolutely. I think insects really are the backbone of global biodiversity. They represent about 50% of the global animal biomass in the world. And alarmingly for us humans, habitat loss is resulting in biodiversity decline in insect species that is outpacing all other animal types. So it's occurring 8 times faster than that of vertebrates. Insects really are the fundamental basis of our food chain.
And we're also suffering, catastrophic insect loss at the moment, or biodiversity loss across the board, but insects in particular are disappearing, and they're obviously the least categorized as well.
Absolutely, and I think we're certainly the least aware of it because so many insects are present and active at night. They're not necessarily that visible. I think the one thing that maybe your audience will resonate with, if you cast your minds back 20, 25 years, driving along back late at night, something called the number plate splat phenomenon. And a recent study here in the UK has just shown how much number plate splatting has declined over the last 20 years. And a really interesting study done here in the south of England, but it's completely synonymous with the rest of the world, really, about number splats that are placed on the front of your number plate or windscreen. And it's a big scientific study that's done across the world, and it's showing that insect biodiversity is declining as much as 60% in the last 20 years, which is a phenomenal and alarming rate of change. I'm only in my mid-20s, but I can certainly remember my earlier years and the number of insects you'd be wiping off your windscreen. It feels like the British summers that's really no longer quite the case.
And that has, talking, the commodities world, that has significant implications for the agri sector in particular, right?
Absolutely. I mean, if we talk about insects and the use of insecticides and pollinators, insects are such a fundamental part of the commodities that we produce, particularly agricultural commodities, plants, etc., that require pollination. They are certainly, there's a reduction in biodiversity, but also an increase in pest species and certain types of insect weevils and fruit fly, etc. So concentrations of not necessarily the type of insects that we want to encourage, and that's as a result of the intensification of farming, certainly the monoculture surrounding farming. So it's not an encouraging trend in either direction, I'm afraid to report.
Yeah. There's one, just I guess because it is going to be crucial for this story, insects organize quite differently to mammals, for example, in how they create, in quotes, intelligence, and how they socialize and operate socially. Can you just give us a sense of some of the sort of the wild, almost, I remember David Attenborough's book years ago, sort of Alien Planet, how different insects are to how, our more familiar animals that are around us.
Absolutely. Well, I'll talk broadly about insects. I mean, there's so many, varieties of species of insects. Even the simple ant has 10,000 different species types. But I'll talk broadly. You and I operate and work with mammalian intelligence, about 87 billion neurons in our brain, and we make individual decisions. So we tackle and solve complex problems. Really, as individuals, that's how we survived and prospered. Insects, on the other hand, don't quite have that luxury. Broad range, but a couple 100,000 neurons compared to our 87 billion. And certainly social insects, like certain ant species, rely on the colony in order to gain and amplify intelligence. So they're not capable of individual decision making, individual problem solving. They don't have a memory, for example, as individuals. They would see the world in two dimension and act on instinct. But yet, as a colony, they show a remarkable amplification of intelligence and find pretty interesting ways of adapting collectively. So it's the group, in effect, that becomes the brain. It's the shared connections between the insects in a social colony that function as intelligent organisms.
And that is going to play, because we're getting there, I imagine people are still quite baffled, is going to play an important part in the second part of this story. But the first part is that there is this drive for more sustainable farming, more sustainable sources of protein, the rise of alternative proteins. And in there's both obviously the sustainability aspect, regenerative farming that has a less impact on insect populations, which, as you say, are so crucial for pollination. And we've covered that in previous episodes. But how you and I became connected was also around this idea of insect farming. And we're already starting to see its prevalence in sort of general media about the future role that insects might have to perform, but certainly could perform, in terms of providing human nutrition or animal nutrition in the form of protein as an alternative to current sources, which are, as we said, in many cases unsustainable. So let's dig into the world of insect farming. Maybe you can give us a broad view of what that is and what has been done to date there.
Absolutely. I got drawn away from the world of London finance into a fascinating waste nutrient recycling business that uses insects as the recycling agent. So I think the best way to picture or imagine this would be to walk down the end of your garden if you've got a compost heap. And in effect, what we try to do on an industrial scale is reproduce the compost heap. So you put organic food waste onto your compost heap. In our case, we'd have to separate out the clean stream organics from the various different mixed plastics, glass, etc., that make their way into the waste chain. So we would get paid to receive and separate that waste, recycle the inorganics, and as you place your organic food waste onto your compost heap, insects then start their work. Not only insects, but obviously various forms of decomposition. But insects, and in particular, if you live in sub-Saharan Africa, you will find black soldier fly larvae, who are one of nature's most efficient recyclers, and they consume organic food waste, bioconvert it into forms of protein, oils, and a frass, which is a form of compost residue that they leave behind, which is very high in NPK values, so your nitrates and potassiums, etc. That on a large industrial scale is what we were doing, really mimicking the function of a compost heap to make protein bioavailable in a different form.
Okay, so the why here is obviously you've got multiple benefits. You're able to tackle organic waste. You're turning that into proteins and oils that can be used in what, we'll come on to that, and also obviously then the NPK that can go into fertilizer. Is this one of many different species that are trying to be used for this? I mean, how prevalent is this, and where is the biggest emphasis? Is the biggest emphasis on the organic waste management, or is it really on the proteins? Just help us understand sort of the broader industry and the scale at which it's at.
Absolutely, yeah. There are probably three or four established global players in this field. The demand, I guess, tends to be driven by the waste economies. So the waste economies of Los Angeles, for example, Japan being a volcanic island makes landfill extremely expensive. Insect factories have tended to pop up in areas where landfill is expensive. It provides a good revenue stream as in effect, a raw material input, and there aren't many businesses that get paid for their raw material input. So the price of waste is certainly important, particularly for our technology that was recycling consumer food waste rather than cleaner organics from, say, brewery grains or spent milk powder or protein powders, etc. This is pure mixed consumer organic waste, so it's driven by that demand. That's your most voluminous product, so you'd want to locate your insect factory close to the waste supply chains. And then on the other hand, it's driven by our global intent to deplete pelagic fish stocks around the world at an alarming rate. We use enormous amounts of fish meal based protein across our agricultural supply chains, whether it's for salmon, shrimp farming, various different aquatic farming practices, for pet food production. And we are very protein thirsty humans, and we are decimating the last fish in the sea to do that. And there's been a huge advent of roller nets that are trawling the bottom surfaces of the ocean for krill and fish stocks to create into protein powder. So this is really a result of two needs, really. One, to recycle food waste and avoid landfill, and the other is to solve a protein crisis. So it really is a full circular economy business.
Yeah, and how, coming back to that sort of, how nascent is this? I mean, are there similar trials going on with other species? Are there similar, farming efforts going on with crickets or whatever it might be to generate other proteins? Is the investment community excited about this and its potential to replace at least those lower value protein demands, like fish, animal nutrition and so forth, where perhaps they're a bit less squeamish about eating a crushed maggots, etc.?
Absolutely, yeah. My view would certainly be that the black soldier fly are the predominant waste recyclers, certainly from an industrialization point of view. But you're absolutely right. Crickets are farmed for various flowers and proteins, as indeed are mealworms on a great industrial scale too. Mealworms being the larval form of the mealworm beetle. So they are also efficient waste recyclers. So those would be probably the mealworm and the black soldier fly on an industrial scale as the two insects that are probably taken forward, and certainly are the insect farmers that have raised the largest capital. The crickets do, and there are various other forms of grubs that you'll see in bar snacks and various different human forms of consumption. There are companies that make an ento milk, so an insect-based milk, and various other products. But in terms of the large scale effect, the industrial businesses are focused really on the black soldier fly and in some part the mealworm too.
Yeah. And because, it sounds a fantastic story, right? It's one of those stories where all things are aligning. You've got sustainability, you're being paid for your inputs, and you're generating three streams of outputs, all of which are increasingly in demand and valued by the world, the commodities sector in particular, of course. But this is no mean feat, right? To get a biological system up and running.
Well, absolutely. It's huge capital expenditure. It is, in effect, forging and fashioning an entirely new agricultural industry. That takes a huge amount of time, a huge amount of technological development. And you're also trying to synchronize the rhythm of nature with that of capital and the industrialization of the factory. Those two processes are not always particularly synchronous, and they take a huge amount of, in effect, artificial intelligence and systems and robotics to try and reproduce the life cycle of the black soldier fly in an industrial environment. There's a huge amount of resistance to that. These are obviously natural organisms that you are trying to control the temperature, the humidity of various different environmental factors to get them to reproduce at an economically efficient scale. And then you've got the challenges of the waste input, as I talked about, that varies throughout different seasons and times of year, is not uniform, has in effect pest species within the waste that you need to kill and denature and terminate. So there's a huge amount of competing forces at play. It is certainly an industry that I believe will form the basis or a large part of protein production in the future, but it's still a long way from that. And if you look at battery powered vehicles, you'd 100% say that within 20 or 30 years time, there won't be any form of propulsion really that relies on oil and gas. And I think you could certainly make that claim for insect farming and protein production from alternative sources away from fish meal. But that industry will take its time to evolve and develop, to push out the incumbent industries and practices that are environmentally harmful and have proliferated and taken hold. So as with any societal change or industrial change on this level, it will take time, but I think we're on the right trajectory, and there's certainly a huge amount of capital, interest, and attention being paid on the insect farming space.
Yeah. Just why fish meal in particular? And is that just a starting point, or do you think could this expand to all animal nutrition protein requirements?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it tends to be that you, I guess, when you're trying to replace a product, you go for the high value products first, particularly because of the costs, as I've mentioned, the capital expenditure required to build insect factories. You're going to go right to the top in terms of the replacement. The insect meal, depending on the protein composition, can compete with fish meal, and you're obviously trying to drive the highest price. But things like chicken feed and wild bird dried mealworms are certainly trying to replace some of the pet food proteins as well that are used. So dried mealworms, dried black soldier fly larvae as chicken feed, as pet feed, as reptile feed. So really, I guess you target the high end part of the market while your production costs are high. But there's no reason why insect protein couldn't be used in more intensive industries like the chicken farming industry. But there isn't the price to merit that at the moment.
Yeah, I do find this fascinating. One final question. I mean, obviously, one of the challenges that we've talked about on the show before is around raising livestock is, of course, the disease load and the propensity to have, half your crop, in inverted commas, destroyed overnight, as we're seeing right now going on with bird flu across Europe. Do these, black soldier fly larvae suffer from viruses, etc.? Can you have a catastrophic collapse in your population as a result of pathogens?
Well, insects are actually nature's purification agents. They really are specialists in the highly efficient rematerialization of organic waste. And in doing that, they display an incredible amount of antimicrobial properties, particularly larvae. I mean, Genghis Khan used insect larvae to clean the wounds of his soldiers many hundreds of years ago. So they really are very strong at eradicating disease-causing bacteria in the waste and in the process. And they create a biologically secure source of protein and oil. So yes, there are challenges of reproducing them through a complex industrially engineered process, but disease is not really necessarily one of them. I think keeping other insect pest species eggs out of the food waste is certainly a challenge, but it doesn't tend to be one that we encountered in the reproductive life cycle.
Right. Okay. Well, I will leave people to reach out to you directly. I'll put notes in the show notes about this. But obviously, it's fascinating, and I definitely think it's a trend that is going to become increasingly important over the next 20 years, especially as many of these activities start to get supported by whether it's carbon credits or subsidies, etc.
The HC Insider podcast is brought to you by HC Group, a retained search, intelligence and advisory firm focused solely on the global energy and commodity sector. With 6 locations across Asia, Europe and the Americas, and over 50 consultants. To find out more, go to our website, hcgroup.global. There, you can also sign up for our HC Insider content for more interviews and white papers on relevant trends and talent impacts in the commodities world.
I guess you left the physical world of insects for the virtual world of insects, and we come back to this point about how insects amplify intelligence through many, many, many individuals. Can you talk about the next stage of your journey with insects and how that starts to really tie up with the financial world of commodities?
Absolutely, yeah. So I guess I was fascinated by this thread of biomimicry, in effect, the ability to reproduce some of nature's ingenuity that has accumulated over many hundreds of thousands of years. And it was that idea that really led me to trading and trading systems. I partnered with a former man vector manager, a guy called Pan Yanaku, who had a series of 16 systems that traded individually, much like the mammalian way that I spoke about earlier, about trading for, in effect, individual survival. All these 16 systems are capable of individual decision making and, in effect, solving the trading problem of trying to buy low, sell high more efficiently than most, let's say. So that's one way to make a decision. And as traders or fund managers, we are professional decision makers paid to make decisions. And it occurred to both Pan and myself that perhaps there was a different way to make decisions. Perhaps we could turn towards nature to understand how, in effect, nature's decision makers might inform a slightly different trading or investment process. And that's what we've created with the Swarm 16 program and information sharing matrix.
Yeah. So, okay. So that sounds quite abstract at the moment. Can you, I guess, break it down for us? Because I find this fascinating. Break it down for us. How exactly are decisions made within the colony, and how that start to translate into this new theory for how you could apply it to systematic trading?
Absolutely. So there are three principles that we've mimicked from the way in which specifically ant colonies function. The first of which is they are incredibly efficient information exchangers. So they swap information through a pheromone trail, through a chemical trail, and they do that with other local agents in their colony. Having exchanged that information, they make a decentralized decision based upon the information that they've received from their other colony participants. So it's decentralized decision making that particularly fascinates me, because it allows the colony to manage and allocate resource to where it's required most. So we mimic the second factor, which is decentralized decision making. And the third is that each of those agents, in our case, systematic programs, can get allocated out roles which they adopt flexibly as required by the colony, based upon learnt rules and behaviors or interactions with other colony members. So this is an organization system that we've copied from nature. It's led to the survival over hundreds of millions of years and incredible species proliferation within ants and insects. And we've applied that to a trading program. So we take 16 systems, which were the underlying engines that Pan had developed for his previous fund. And instead of getting them to trade as individuals, we follow those three principles that we've learned. So we get these 16 systems to swap information in all of their possible combinations. Having exchanged that information, they make a decentralized decision based upon the information they've learned and received from the other 15 systems.
I know it might be a stupid question. I guess I just don't understand what you mean by decentralized. Can you characterize for us exactly what you mean by a decentralized decision?
Right. So a centralized decision would be one made by a person or actor that makes decisions based upon only their own input or information. So we as humans are centralized decision makers. We see a piece of information, we process it, and we make a decision accordingly. What ants or insect colonies are doing are making decisions based upon what the other actors in their network or colony are doing. So that's why it becomes a decentralized decision, because they are making a decision to, in effect, go out to a new food source or to provide structural defenses for the colony. But that decision is based upon the actions of the other participants in their colony. And that's why it's a decentralized decision.
Okay, so one of those 16, or the ant, is saying no food here. I'm moving off over here. That will then inform the other fund to say, well, whether it's going to buy or sell, as opposed to this centralized algorithm that says if X, then Y, right? So
Absolutely.
So it depends, and I guess it depends on which ant the ant bumps into, or in this case, which of the 16, last communicates with one of the other 15. Is that right?
Absolutely. So within these information sharing matrices, we assign roles to each of the underlying 16 systems. So based upon what each others are doing, some of them are defensive, some of them are attacking, some of them borrow conviction from systems that are idle. So about 20% of an ant colony is permanently dormant, waiting for a new opportunity, as are a certain percentage of our systems. They don't trade. They wait for a new opportunity and give up their volatility or risk to another system. Some act in reverse. They seek to provide protection or diversification when they see the colony, or in our case, our financial markets, are overexposed or over-correlated in one direction. And the idea is that these 16 markets that trade futures across commodities, stock indices, interest rates, and currencies, these systems are completely interchangeable. They are all traded using the same underlying methodology, but they're focused on a role-based allocation based on what's best for the group. So the gold trader or the oil trader doesn't make a decision based upon its own system. It makes a decision based upon what the other 16 systems are doing, and may make a decision to go short oil when it realizes that the oil market is rising to provide protection, or to catch a trend before it reverses. So that is the fundamental philosophy shift from a traditional decision to a swarm-inspired trading decision.
Right. So at the moment, your 16 are across these asset classes. You could presumably say, I just want a pure commodities swarm or colony, and they're going to be making those decisions among the 42, making it up, different commodity contracts.
Absolutely. The value in the IP that we've created is, I guess, not only in the 40 months of track record that we've created in this strategy, but it is around the swarm technology theory. And it says essentially that we have found a very effective strategy that mimics ant colony optimization, and that has the ability to solve a series of different real life problems, whether it's swarm technology that's used in movement coordination or understanding crowd behavior, decision making, trading in our case. Even in robotics, there is an area of science that is looking at swarm intelligence and swarm-based decision making. So we could use that across a series of different financial markets. In effect, the markets we choose to trade were chosen well before we developed the swarm matrix. So there is certainly value in making decisions differently and mimicking this style of intelligence. And that's what we seek to capture. We can't claim that we have absolutely reproduced swarm intelligence, but we have reproduced a decision-making method and methodology that is very different to the rest of the participants in financial markets. And that shows up with our correlations and our performance over a period of time.
We will obviously put notes or the links to Swarm in the show notes. I do have a couple of questions. One is, I guess when you think about applying this to other industries, other problems, whatever it might be, the real challenge is both in getting the roles correct, right? In trading, it's relatively more simple, I guess, buy, sell, hold off. I don't want to oversimplify it, but trying to get the roles right for whatever application you're using, where there aren't such analogous roles that you see from a colony. And secondly, I guess as well, in this particular case, surely you've really in effect only got 16 ants. So I'm assuming it would work a lot better if you had 32 ants, for example.
Absolutely. Well, just to answer the point about the roles, of course, that requires human interaction, human programming, as would any AI system. But in our case, the roles slightly adapt across time as the system learns. So it's not necessarily machine learning, but a very slow form of machine evolution, as we call it. And then to come to the second part of the question. So between 16 markets, there are actually 65,534 nodes or information exchange points. So that's all the two-way combinations in the colony, all the three-way combinations, four-way combinations, etc. And what we have done is reversed engineered and reduced the number of ants or systems. And that sees a breakdown in the swarm intelligent effect at about 9 to 10 markets. But increasing the markets beyond 16, the number of nodes and interaction points in the colony becomes almost exponential. So 32, you would need almost NASA level computing power, or quantum computing, if you like, to do that. So the way in which we would expand this program is expanded out sideways with overlapping markets. So a second set of 16 markets that shared a market in common across each of the four asset classes, rather than expanding the matrix outwards that would require huge amounts more of information processing and not necessarily a more efficient outcome. If we come back to the ant colony, the whole ant colony doesn't communicate and exchange information with each other. Ant colonies are enormous, can expand and span hundreds of miles. In effect, how ant colonies work is they work in smaller pockets and they transfer information efficiently, almost like a Mexican wave effect in the stadium. So locally initially, and then it passes through. And that's certainly what we will try to mimic as we expand the program's capacity and reach to other markets.
Yeah. So tell us a little bit about I don't want to turn into a plug, but tell us a little bit about the performance. I am fascinated by, whether you're seeing a real sustained outperformance of other systematic trading models and even just, poor old humans.
Yeah, well, I think, Paul, it would be not such a good story if we then produced a pretty correlated trend following program. And I guess the proof is in the output. We've been trading for 3.5 years, returned 57.29%, with a correlation of 0.08 to our benchmark, which is the SocGen CTA index, which is the largest 20 systematic strategies and funds, and then a correlation of 0.03 to the S&P. So I guess if you're looking to diversify, you diversify across asset classes, but it would make sense to diversify in the way in which your decisions are made. And I think there's a huge amount that we can learn from a very different way of thinking.
I guess getting a little bit philosophical, have you in any way sort of distilled what you think it is that really makes the difference? Is it the speed of decision making? Is it how I'm just trying to get some sense of how sort of this looks different. Can you sort of compare to your traditional sort of, whether it's a algorithmic based or human based? I mean, what is it about this the swarm intelligence that really makes it look so different in practice?
Yeah, to answer the philosophical element of the question first, in effect, all an insect colony is the equivalent of a computerized neural network with a set of rules and a set of, in effect, decision-making capabilities. And all you have with computers standing back is you assemble enough neurons and nodes, in our case, ants and information exchange points. And the power of their information exchange amplifies through that process. And in our case, it amplifies significantly beyond the cumulative power of the group. So 1,000 ants are much more intelligent as a colony. They have a cumulative power of intelligence than 1,000 ants individually. So that's what we have in effect done. We've taken 16 price inputs into our program. We trade very slowly, so you might expect us to be high frequency traders. We're not. We're fairly slow moving. And in effect, we create a matrix of those 65,534 synthetic data points. And then we look to allocate out our rules-based, agent-based roles from the information that is in the shared data. Now, I might give you this quick analogy, is that if you had a temperature trader and a rainfall trader, so let's say you're the temperature trader, Paul, and you're an expert, you're an individual, a human, you trade temperature, and I am a rainfall trader and I trade all the rainfall patterns. I'm an absolute meteorological expert. And instead of getting us to just trade our individual two markets, we create a synthetic indice called temp rain. So we create a price series or a data series called temp rain. And now, instead of making your decision as the temperature trader just using the information from your market, you look at temperature, temp rain, and rain. And based upon what I'm doing as the rainfall trader, also looking at those three combinations, we make our decision for, in effect, the good of the three markets or the three price series. So is it true that there is more information in temp rain than there is in temperature and rain? And my argument would be no, you can't create more information. But is there different information in the temp rain series? And is there a different way of making a decision to trade temperature and rainfall based upon the information in temp rain? We would argue yes. And that's in effect what we are doing as efficient information extractors.
Yeah, fascinating. Well, congratulations on the performance. I mean, one final question. Again, I just find the topic fascinating. Is this, are we talking about a pretty nascent theory in terms of finance that you and Pan have come up with? Where do you see the applications, or are many different firms trying to hunt this down? Just give us some sense of where this could head. Could this be actually a decision making, at least from a theory standpoint, a breakthrough?
I think there's certainly more applications beyond trading individual markets, maybe at a portfolio level to assess and make decisions on a series of different portfolios. We're not aware of anyone else that is using this application of swarm technology or swarm intelligence in this industry. As I said, it is used in communication, in robotics, in understanding crowd theory and behavior. And there is a growing academic body that are looking at, in effect, ant colony optimization and swarm intelligence. But I think we are, safe to say, the first mover in financial markets, and we've got some interesting plans beyond the Swarm 16 program. That said, there's still a lot of work to do with that, and we are busy away with it.
Again, thank you very much for your time, and it's been a fascinating discussion. And hopefully we can check in back with you guys in the future and see where it's headed, and also talk again on the insect farming side.
Look forward to it. Thanks very much, Paul.
Thank you for listening. If you enjoyed this episode and want to support the show, please give us a positive review on Apple Podcasts or Spotify.
To find out more about HC Insider and HC Group, a search and advisory firm dedicated to the commodity markets, visit our website at www.hcgroup.global. There you can find out more about our services and our offices around the world. There you can also find more content, from interviews to insight pieces to more podcasts focused on the commodity value chains. Thanks again for listening.